about pork.
You're slacking. You're eating instead of ringing the bell. Good morning. We're running a little bit late today. Keith was eating. He was fantasizing about eating. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in Joshua the 11th chapter. We're going to finish it up today and move into the 12th chapter. If you'll remember, last week we were Joshua was cleaning up the northern part of the Promised Land, and we're going to kind of finish up this verse and finish up the conquest of the northern part of Israel and the Promised Land, and then we'll move on. He has one more foe to overcome, and then he's going to be in pretty good shape. It's just going to be kind of a mop up after this campaign. And one of the things we talked about last week, I think we need to keep in mind as we go through this is this didn't happen in a couple of weeks. This happened over a period of years. And I was studying for a little bit ahead and came across another theory. Some of the ancient scholars said that this was a 5-year episode that we're talking about here. Some of the Jewish writers says it was a 7 or 8 year. Then there was another one based on some writings that were found in the 1990s that were back in that time period. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. That kind of indicated that it was 6 years. So this is just a synopsis of the things that the children of Israel were doing, and the next couple verses we're going to go over kind of wraps up the major campaigns, but that's not going to be completely the end of the mopping up that needs to go on.
Actually, have some possible years: 1405 to 1398 BC.
So, before we go any further, I'd like for Carol Browning, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer. Amen. Probably better shut my phone off. That would be a good idea. So let's look at verses 21 and 22. This is kind of the wrap up of the battles that we've been talking about. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Amazites from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Amazites left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, in Ashdod, and there remained. So basically we see here that this is kind of the wrap up of the major battles that Joshua fought with the children of Israel against the Canaanites. And we see here that this is kind of the first time that Joshua refers to Canaan as the land of the sons of Israel. So this kind of signals that there's been a transition between the land of the Canaanites and now it's the land of the children of Israel. Now these Amazites were pretty mighty warriors, and if we look back in Numbers 13 and 28. When they sent out the 10 spies, they were really scared of this group. And I don't know if that had anything to do while this was kind of the last battle or what. But this was a mighty group of people that they were getting ready to fight. But we were going to see that Israel destroyed them also. And, like everything else, as long as they followed the things that God told them to do, then there was going to be victory over this group. So pretty much this takes care of the rest of the northern part of Israel that has been taken, the mountain regions and the probably the tougher battles that were going to be fought. This kind of brings all of that to a close and brings the children of Israel to a situation where they basically have control of the land. But that's not to say that there weren't some pockets of resistance that were going to have to be cleaned up as time went on. Comments about those verses?
Anak means long neck, and of course you alluded to the scripture numbers. These are the people that when the spies went in, that they considered themselves to be grasshoppers. Apparently these were very tall people, and they were considered to be the descendants of the Nephilim. You might remember the giants that are mentioned in Genesis. Well, the Anakins were considered to be maybe their ancestor, or the Nephilim were their ancestors.
Any other comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verse 23. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. So basically here we see that Joshua had subdued pretty much the whole land that was going to be given to him. And in a sense there was no more really huge battles that the children of Israel were going to have to fight. That's not to say that there weren't going to be some skirmishes among the tribes, but the major operation where all the children of Israel were going to have to band together pretty much ended here with this battle. And God was pretty much going to expect the individual tribes to subdue any remaining towns or pockets of resistance that they might come upon in the area that they were assigned. So taking of the whole land does not imply that all the towns and villages had been conquered, and that all the Canaanites had been rooted out from every corner of the land. But it simply said that that they had conquest over the character and the power of the Canaanites, and they had broken their spirit. They had defeated their major armies, and they weren't going to be a force that we're going to have to deal with anymore. They pretty much had been dominated, and they had been overthrown from their power, and they had been pushed out of their seats of power. And pretty much the Israelites had all of the land under their control. But there still remained, some fugitive groups that were going to need to be conquered and be taken care of. But that was going to be left up to the individual tribes. And in God's wisdom, he knew that they had the power to destroy them as long as they did the things that that God would have them to do. And if they strive to fulfill the commandments, he was going to preserve them, and they were gradually going to be able to exterminate the remnants of resistance that were still there. Now, the word of God that to Moses, which the writer alludes to here in verse 23, probably refers to what was written in Exodus, the 23rd chapter, verses 27 through 33. And it says, I will send my fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come, and I will make all thine enemies turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and beasts of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee until thou be increased and inherit the land. And I will set thy bounds before the Red Sea, even the sea of the Philistines, and the desert unto the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and thou shalt drive them out before thee. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods, and they shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee sin against thee. For it thou serve their God, it will surely be a snare unto thee. So, God had given these instructions to Moses, and I think it's probably pretty clear that these instructions were passed down to Joshua also through Moses, and that he was going to be actually the one that was going to drive the Canaanites out of their land, and it was going to be done. It's going to be done little by little. And if you think back to what we've studied so far with these battles, they pretty much did everything that God wanted them to do, with the one exception when they made peace with one of the tribes. But that tribe ended up being slaves to the children of Israel. So this is how the conquest of the land had advanced thus far, and it's going to continue until the completion of God's will in this area. So the major war with the Canaanites has ended, but there's still going to be some minor battles and some mopping up operations that are still going to be necessary. And not only did the Israelites obtain the land, but they defeated the Canaanite kings and broke all of their power. And there has never been a greater war for a greater cause. And I thought it was interesting. One of the writers from the 1700s talked about the Battle of Waterloo, how it decided the fate of Europe. But this series of battles in Canaan pretty much decided the fate of the world. So these were very important battles that happened in the land of Canaan at that time. Any other comments about that chapter?
Going back, I was wondering why God wanted the horses hobbled and the chariots burned. But going back and studying a little bit on that, they said that he wanted the people to rely on him.
Absolutely.
And not their own skills or art of war. That's why he had the horses disabled and the chariots.
Right. Okay. Well, I thought I had it set up here, but I don't. So now let's move on to the 12th chapter. Okay. So basically, what we're going to look at here in the 12th chapter in the first 6 verses is the slaughter of the eastern kings. We've taken care of the south, we've taken care of the north. Now we're going to kind of move to the east and take care of the kings there. So Joshua, or whoever else the historian is that might have contributed to this particular verse, kind of comes here and sums up the conquest that Israel's made in these verses, and kind of goes back and gives a complete overview of the things that had happened up to this point, even going back to the time when they first moved into the land, and also going back a little bit further into the conquest that they had while Moses was still alive, before they inherited the promised land. So this chapter pretty much contains a recap of the conquest made in the promised land, with some additional mention of some of the places that were not formally mentioned and given detail on in the chapters we've talked about before. So this is kind of a wrap up of all the battles that we've talked about, and we're going to go through this chapter rather quickly, because you get to the end, it just names a whole bunch of kings, a whole bunch of people. So I'm not going to have to slaughter their names and all of that kind of stuff. We're just going to kind of say that it's all there, make a couple comments, and move on. So let's look at verse 1. It says, "Now these are the kings of the land which the children of Israel smote, and possessed their land on the other side Jordan, toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon unto the Mount Hiram, and all the plains in the east." So Aaron here was Arnon was the boundary of the southern coast of the land, and it was occupied by the Israelites beyond Jordan, and the mountains of Hermon were the boundaries to the north. So what we're seeing here is that we're kind of making a visual or a mental map of the area that we're talking about here. So Arnon takes it rise in the mountains of Gilead, and having run a long way from the north to south, falls into the Dead Sea, near the same place into which Jordan discharges itself. So, all the plains here to the east is the plains of Moab to Mount Hermon. So we're defining the area that the children of Israel were going to inhabit. Now, the thing about it is, and we know this from the scriptures, and we know this from history, God gave them a whole lot of land, a whole lot more land than they were actually going to be able to, to completely occupy. So what we're going to see here is, they didn't completely inhabit every bit of this thing or this land that God gave them, but it also kind of gave them a buffer against, enemies that would be in other directions. Comments about that verse?
Remember, this is the land too that Reuben, Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh said, "Well, we'll take this land."
Right.
Before they even crossed Jordan, they like that land.
Yeah, they like that pasture and all that kind of good stuff over there. So let's go on to verse 2. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon and ruled in Aroer, which is upon the bank of the river Aron, and from the middle of the river, and from half Gilead unto the river Jobok, which is the border of the children of Ammon. So basically, this was taken from the Moabites in prior history, and it was made the capital city. Now we can read about this in Numbers 21 and 26, and we see here a kind of an unusual situation. This king, he ruled from one city, but he lived in another, because he just didn't have the army or the will, or some reason the other group was so strong, he wasn't going to be able to conquer them. They were going to still do their own thing, but he was still going to use their city as his capital. So he lived one place and basically, I guess, commuted and worked in another. We also notice here, when they were making the boundary, they made it the middle of the river. And I'm sure this was a compromise somewhere along the line because of the water rights and things along that line. Normally, when you do a battle, you stop at a river at the bank and you make that a line. And this is kind of interesting here because it's the middle of the river. Today, when we set a boundary, we set it at the low water mark of the river on the other side. West Virginia owns the Ohio River to the low water mark over in Ohio. So the river belongs to West Virginia, even though it's called the Ohio River. Okay, and that's the way we do things now. But we see here that they divided it in the middle, and it almost had to be that way because of the importance of water back then. Each group had to have a certain amount of water, so they divided it pretty much right down the middle. And this was the boundary of the Moabites and the Amorites, and the king of the Amorites might be said to rule from the middle of it. So that's how they divide this thing up. And they were very careful when they did this, and it's referred to as half Gilead and half the other group in the ancient writings of Targum and Targum and things along that line. Comments about that verse? All right, let's go and do some more geography here in verse 3. And from the plain of the seas of Chimaroth on the east unto the sea of the plain, even the salt sea on the east, to the way to the whatever that one is, anyway, from the south and under whatever that other one is to the other side. So anyway, the Sea of Chimaroth is pretty much today we refer to it as the Sea of Tigris, and the Salt Sea here is kind of interesting. The way that this was translated from the original Hebrew or original writings. And it's understood by some to mean the sea at the city of Melech. And where can we find anything that can be called the Salt Sea on the east of the Lake Gemerith? It's just not there. So some of the scholars seem to think we're either talking about the Dead Sea, the Sea of Sodom, or because it's a salt sea also intended there. And these other two cities that I can't pronounce, yeah, and these are cities near the Dead Sea in the plain of Moab. And the second one there is supposed to be a city at the foot of Mount Pisgah. So the Sea of Galilee is also called Lake Tiberias in the Bible. So that's what that's kind of the area that we're referring to here, and that's the way that it's referred to in the gospel. And the name refers to the same large body of water in northern Israel, and it's about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. And the Shion and Og were the first Canaanite kings that Israel defeated. So we're kind of going back a little bit in history and getting an overview of all the things that are happening. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 4. And the coast of Og, the king of Bashan, which was the remnant of the giants that dwelled at Ashtaroth and Edrei. So the country that that this king reigned over was another king of the Amorites, and he was smitten by Israel in the time of Moses. And this is the group that was the remnant of the giants, which was discussed in Deuteronomy 3 and 11. Now the meaning seems to be either that he was the only one that was left of the race of the giants, Amorites, found when they took possession of the country. And this kind of goes back to Deuteronomy 2 and 20, or that was left when the Amorites took it and having this bunch basically pretty much disappeared. And that we've talked about this when we were in studying a little bit in Deuteronomy about they were large men, big stature, real strong, a lot of courage, and they were very good warriors. They're mentioned in Genesis 6 and 4. It says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were old men of renown. So the giants were begotten on the daughters of Cain, and by the children of Seth, who went down from the mountain to them in the days of Jared. And they were known for their tallness and strength, for their power and domination, but they were also known for their tyranny and for their oppression. So, this was the remnants of this group of people that we're talking about here. And these two places that we're talking about here were basically where the palace was for each of these cities that we're talking about. And sometimes the king was at one city, and sometimes he was at the other city, which in that day and time really wasn't that unusual for kings to split their residence. And even today, you think about some of the kings and queens that are still out there ruling. They've got several residences, and probably the one of the best examples is England. There's all kinds of castles all over the place that belong to the king of England, and they got to have some place to put all the relatives. When the time comes. And that's pretty much probably what these kings were. They had a lot of relatives. They had to kind of spread them out to make sure that everything was happening okay, and maybe even keep them in neutral corners for that matter. You just never know. Comments about that verse? Right. Yeah. Not like Andre the Giant.
Of course, we're going to run into one more of those later on in the Bible, a guy named Goliath, who was probably in the
He was a big one, but they cut him down to size.
When the spies came back, Caleb, and they talked about these giants being afraid of them.
Mm-hmm.
Caleb spoke up then and said that we could take that land, and then eventually in time, the land that Caleb gets is this land.
Land of the giants. Yep. Good point. All right. Let's see here. Let's move on to verse 5. And reigned in the Mount Hermon and Salcash and in all Bashan unto the border of Geshuronites and the Meshurites and half of Gilead, the border of Shion, the king of Heshbon. So this is the country of Bashan in the days of Moses and Joshua, and it extended from the river Jabbok on the south to the frontiers of the Jebusites and that other bunch there on the north. And these were at the foothills of Mount Hermon. So this is another area that that the children of Israel were possessing after all these battles. So let's move on to verse 6. Then did Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel smite, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it for a possession unto the Reubenites and the Gadites and half the tribe of Meshach. So basically, fresh mercies must not drown the the remembrance of the things that happened before, and that's why this is here. It's reminding the children of Israel that there were things that were done prior to Joshua that helped get them set up in the things that they were, the blessings that they were going to give. And the writer here is giving Moses credit for laying the foundation for all the success that they were having. And Moses was a man of God, and God was absolutely on his side, and he did a lot of good things for the children of Israel. His time had passed, but the things that he had done kind of came forward, and it's just like people that have done things in the past that we benefit from. This was a deal here where the children of Israel were benefiting from the things that Moses had done in the generation prior. So we see here that these are instruments that were used in the past that and they needed to give honor and respect to the things that that Moses had done, because he laid the foundation for all the things that were going to happen. Now Joshua's services and achievements are confessed here in great detail, but don't overlook the things and the foundation that Moses had laid. And he's telling these people, remember the things that Moses had done, because he laid the foundation for all the benefits that that they're getting at the present time.
These things were really probably taken before the crossing, so Moses was still alive.
Right, and he was their leader. Obviously, he didn't lead the army. Joshua, was pretty much the general, but Moses was the power behind the throne in this situation. So the distribution of this country, Moses assigned it to 2 tribes and half of the other. And this was pretty much at their request. This was great land. It was good farmland. It had lots of water. It was good for what these tribes wanted to do. And Moses, through the revelation and guidance from God, saw this and allowed these tribes to have this really good land. But they still had to go forward and help take the rest of the land. They couldn't just stop there and rest on their laurels. They had to to work their way through it. So the dividing of it that was conquered here was an example to Joshua on how it must be done, and how the conquered country on the other side of Jordan needed to be done, so that there was an equal division among the tribes. And there's a lot of stuff you had to think about there. You had one of the biggest things was you had to think about water supply, because this was barren land, and water was very important. And there had to be some wisdom, I'm sure some revelation from God to Joshua how to divide this up so that each tribe had what they needed to flourish with. And one of the biggest things that over in the Middle East is water. And there's sometimes there's water and sometimes there's not. So any comments about those verses before we move on? So now we're going to look at verses 7 through 24, and this is basically talking about the slaughter of the Western kings. And the writer here identifies the kings in the order in which Joshua defeated them. And many of the same names appear in a letter called the Amorah. And this was a historical document that was discovered in 1887. And it was called the Amorah Letters. And it was a group of inscribed clay tablets that was discovered in 1877 at Amorah. It's a site in Egypt on the east bank of the Nile, about 190 miles south of Cairo. Now, there were 382 of these letters, and archaeologists say that this is one of the greatest archaeological proofs of the history of the Bible and the accuracy of the Bible. And it also references the conquest under Joshua of the Promised Land. And it basically confirms everything that's in the Bible is accurate. And these were letters from Jerusalem written in Amoraic text, and they're from a Canaanite ruler to Abda-Heba, which was a Egyptian. So he states that he is a soldier for the king, my lord, and requests that the Egyptian monarch send him a messenger and some military men to help him resist his enemies. Now, the enemies that he's talking about here is the children of Israel. And this is basically a group of letters that were sent back over to Egypt to request some help in the battle against the children of Israel. Now, out of these 382 letters, there was only a handful of them that actually talked about what we're talking about here. A lot of them were correspondence and ambassadors would send each other. They talked about a lot of different things, but this one particular group talked specifically about what we've just talked about in the battle. So comments about that verse. All right, let's look at verse 7. And these are the kings of the country which Joshua, the children of Israel, smote on this side Jordan on the west, from Bangalag in the valley of Lebanon, even into the mount of Halak, that goes up to Sur, which Joshua gave unto the tribe of Israel for a possession according to their divisions. And moving on to verse 8, it says, in the mountains and in the valleys and in the plains and in the springs and in the wilderness and the south country, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites. So basically, we're going to see a list here of 31 chief towns that were given by God to the children of Israel. And it basically is just an area that extends only about 15 miles in length and about 50 in breadth. So we're talking about just relatively small area. But what you basically had here was a bunch of little kingdoms or call them capital cities that belong to petty and insignificant kingdoms. I would kind of relate this to a county. You got these are cities that are in a county, like a county seat or something like that, and they're ruled by they call him a king, but it would be more like a commissioner or something like that. And with few exceptions, they were not the scenes of any important events recorded in the history here, because it really wasn't that big of a deal. It was just a small part of the bigger battle that lasted 6 to 7 years. So we also know here that the description is not complete. This is not a exhaustive list of all of the towns and areas that Joshua conquered, because there were several that's left out. Shechem is not mentioned, and the hills of Ephraim, they're kind of separately represented, and the territory of Hazor. All of these are just kind of like counties that is in this particular area, and that goes from verse 9 all the way to verse 24. And I'm not going to embarrass myself trying to read the names of all these people, so we'll just kind of if you want to know, there is some information out there, and the king of each one of these you can find a reference for in some of the commentaries and things like that, who these particular kings were. And I went through the list, and there's nothing spectacular that any of these guys did other than just being the king and getting defeated. There wasn't any historical significance to any of them. And basically, we're talking here about 30 kings that are mentioned here in these verses through verse 24. So most of these kings and these areas were defeated back when we were talking about the battles in the 10th chapter. So the writer seeks to compile a list that will impress the reader with the greatness of the feat of God in working for Israel, and of the greatness of the leadership of Joshua, and following the example of Moses, and completing the tasks that were given by Moses. And there's by all accounts, Joshua was a great military leader. And he focused in on what he needed to focus on. He led by example. When he needed to be there, he was there. When he could send somebody, he would send somebody. But by all counts, Joshua can be rated with the greatest military leaders of all time. And why would he not be? Because God was behind him, and he did the things that God told him to do. And that was the reason that he was so successful. So basically, this summary concludes the record of the conquest of the land that we've talked about in chapters 1 through 12. And this was, Joshua's major responsibility of taking these lands, leading the children of Israelites in battle. And with one exception, he was very successful. And that one exception, if you'll remember, he didn't follow God's plan, and it got him in trouble. He learned his lesson, which is a good thing, and he went on from that point and defeated the people. Bill, are you going to say something?
The word one is used constantly there as emphasis, and it's like it kind of reminds you, if you were making a list and you're saying, okay, got to do this, check, got to do this, check. That's basically what that one is doing.
He's following the plan. So he was able to. You can go and get up, ring the bell. He was able to. No, I wouldn't do that. That's right. I just got one more comment. He was able to divide the land among the Israelites, and that's what we'll talk about in chapters 13 through 21. And dividing the land up is his second great work that we're going to talk about in the rest of the chapter. So appreciate everybody's attention, comments today.